Oxford University has certainly not been an institution which has, should we say, slowly evolved over the centuries. There have been sudden moments of change where it's almost reinvented itself. And I would have thought that the three most obviously significant moments would be 1214, when what had been a very ad hoc and impermanent institution became a permanent institution with the establishment of the first Chancellor. And that really was what turned into what we call a university rather than simply a collection of schools. So I'd go for 1214, and then I'd probably emphasise 1534, which was the moment when Henry VIII insisted that the universities of Oxford and Cambridge had to sort of comply with his decision to break away from Rome. And the fallout from that was very important in that it began what was going to be an extremely significant development in the university's history. It began the drift into the university of people who were not bound for the church. It was really from the middle of the 16th century the university began to fill up with the sons of gentlemen, rather than just being a university for potential members of the clergy. So the sort of laicization of Oxford that really starts from the Reformation is, I think, the second most important turning point in its history. Until then, it had been a clerical university. And perhaps that the third one's very difficult because so much happens, especially from the middle of the 19th century. I'd probably go for 1921, which is the moment when the university decided it would take the king's shilling. It was from that moment on that it accepted funding from the state. And I think without taking money from the state, it could never have developed into the world-class university it is today. I'd start off with John Wycliffe, one of Oxford's great scholastic philosophers and theologians, but different and more radical in that his discussions of theology led him not simply to take up kind of interesting doctrinal positions, but actually in so doing to challenge the way the church was actually structured. So he, more than any of the other great medieval figures, has a much wider influence outside the university world than the others have done. So I'd probably go for Wycliffe. In the early modern period, very difficult, but possibly John Locke, who was a student at Christ Church in the 1660s and 1670s, and whose political and religious thought had such a profound influence on the Enlightenment and through the Enlightenment on the world we live in today. I suppose he's the most influential of all the political philosophers that Oxford's ever produced. And finally, and perhaps a bit controversially, of all the people in the 20th century, I'd probably emphasise Howard Florey, who came to this country and to Oxford from Australia, was first of all a research student at Magdalen before eventually becoming professor of pathology in the 1930s, and of course is associated with the development of penicillin, and through penicillin affecting the lives of all of us. There have been many great scientists that Oxford has produced in the 20th century, but I thought that Florey stands out, along with Chaim, the man he worked with, as the two people who probably had the most influence in the world, on the world as a whole. So for that reason, it's very difficult not to choose Florey, I think. Oxford has developed its footprint enormously across the second half of the 20th century. It is now anyway a sort of multi-site university, whereas perhaps back in 1945 it was still centred primarily around the Bodleian and the buildings on the science area. And in so doing, it has been responsible for putting up a lot of very interesting and sometimes extravagantly entertaining buildings to look at. But are they going to last? I don't know. A lot of them, of course, were built not to last, and we're already beginning to take some of them down. The colleges, on the other hand, have tended to try to build in a way that they built before, and many of the new college buildings are supposed to last for centuries. Whether they should last, whether all these buildings should have a definite life, I don't know. I wouldn't like to see Wellington Square still here in 200 years, but there are buildings, and I can talk about that later, that I think really ought to be maintained as far as it's possible to do so. So it's a mixed answer. I think that some of the buildings that people have are marvellous, others are terrible.